All right. Hi, I'm Armin, and I will be teaching this class on advanced Scandinavian cuisine. I'm not sure how many of you were in the earlier class on beginning Scandinavian cuisine, but this is going to build on that and assumes that everybody kind of has a fairly good grip on what Scandinavian cuisine is, what the Viking Age is, and then we're going to look at more details on how animal husbandry works, what the fisheries around the area were, how agriculture was done, and then pulling all of that together and looking at how that affects the cuisine of Scandinavia during the early Viking Age. My point of study is actually more Vendel, looking at like 480 up until about 750. Most people don't understand that. So I also do Viking Age classes. This one is going to be more focused on that Vendel period before there was as much of an expansion of the Scandinavian culture. So we're going to be looking at just Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, and that cluster of culture that existed there from around 450 to around 750, and how the agriculture and the environment affected what people eat and why they eat it, and what we can do to try to recreate that. And the overarching goal with early Scandinavian cuisine, as with a lot of points of study, is we are trying to be less wrong. None of what I'm telling you is going to be 100% correct. We just don't know. There's not the information there, but it is as correct as I've been able to get to, and I've been at this for about 8 years now. And there's just more and more information that comes out every year. We'll also look at, kind of towards the end, a couple of studies that just came out this year that have changed some of my perceptions on what people were eating, and that I need to then work into the cuisine that I'm putting out. Mundanely, I work as an HP solution architect. I also do fees for nonprofit organizations. We do one every year for the Swedish Cultural Center in Seattle. I've done some fundraisers for the Nordic Heritage Museum. Going to be in the Norwegian American next week too. They've got a whole Viking episode issue. If you are not subscribed to the Norwegian American or don't know what it is, it's the Norwegian newspaper in America, and you can sign up for just one episode if you would like, and the next paper is all Viking Age all the time. It should have some really good stuff in it. Sorry, crass commercial announcement. So let's look at what resources that we have for developing the cuisine of the time and seeing what people ate and what their day-to-day lives were. We live in a time that is fantastic. We can go online. There is just a treasure trove of information out there. You can read papers that 20 years ago you would have to order into a library for. It's fantastic. Vikings are also, they're a hot commodity right now. They are sexy, and that has made it so that there is more funding, just plain and simple. And with funding, we get more research. With more research, then we can take a look at all of these things that were put aside and then dig deeper into them and find out more about the food. Food particularly has gotten a huge resurgence in how much someone cares. 25 years ago, there were just not that many people that gave a shit about archaeological food finds, especially in the Viking Age. That just was not a thing that there was a lot of money and time being spent on. This has changed a lot. People worldwide are much more interested in food. They're much more interested in history, and that just makes it so that there's more funding so that we can have more research. And with that more research, we can make better food. And I've just been really excited. Every year there is new and wonderful things that come out. And then you have to take all of that information and then you weave all those little parts together and then spit out various dishes and flavor profiles that would be appropriate for the area and the time that we're looking at. And that has been endlessly fun and entertaining. It has not gotten boring in any way. And it just keeps getting better. And I've been excited with it, and I'm excited that other people are interested in it as well. So I'm going to start digging in. We're going to go into animal husbandry. Animal husbandry is one of the most important parts of agriculture in early Scandinavian area. Everybody had animals. There were sheep, you have goats, you have chickens, you have ducks. When you get farther north, you have reindeer, and you have pigs. And as I said in the earlier class, pigs are my nemesis. Any place you get that is populated would have pigs. Pigs will eat all of your crap that you don't want. So any of your waste, the pigs eat. And this goes from human waste to, like, they eat all of the fish bones, and they would eat a large chunk of the animal bones. And why would you throw anything into the garbage pit when you could just feed it to your pigs and turn it into bacon? That's a thing that you do. And so the more pigs that you end up with, the more your record of how the animal husbandry is skews towards large animals like cows. They definitely had cows. Cows were definitely important. Beef looks to be a very socially high level food. So if you wanted to impress people, you feed them beef. If you didn't want to impress people, then you would feed them something lower on the social ladder, like lamb or pork or goat. Horse hits that odd place where it kind of looks like it's religious. It's definitely used in some religious ceremonies. We don't know if it was also just eaten regularly, but also just on particular occasions, you for sure ate it. Kind of like, it's Easter tomorrow. A lot of people are going to be eating lamb and ham because on Easter you eat lamb and ham, but you also eat lamb and ham the rest of the time too. It's just there's things that you eat on holidays as well. One of the biggest sources of caloric intake that you get from your animal husbandry is actually the dairy. They had a very, very robust dairy industry. So all during the summer months, you are going to be grazing your cattle, grazing your sheep, grazing your goats, and then milking them. This also means that they also would have eaten veal. Anytime you have a strong dairy industry, you have a veal industry, because you have to make that choice. Is this calf going to turn into more food for me, or is that calf going to eat more of my food? And then you make that choice, and then most of the male calves you take care of when they're young, and then that's some springtime food. And then you have all of that milk. So then you're going to be processing that, and that was a huge point of caloric intake. There's some evidence when you get over into Iceland that butter was actually used for taxes. Later, after the Viking area, when you get into the early medieval period, and you start getting tax records in Denmark, there's some evidence that cheese was used to pay your taxes in Denmark. So dairy product throughout the Scandinavian world was very important. The oldest evidence of cheese making, which is probably evidence of cheese making, is 2,000 years old, and it's a pot that has what appears to be burnt whey in it, which is, it does not guarantee, but it shows an indication that they were probably making a cheese similar to Gjetost, which is just you make whey and then you boil the whey down, and then the whey is just milk sugars, and then that turns into a caramel, and that caramelized mass is then Gjetost. Commercial Gjetost, they since the 50s started adding cream back into it, because then it became a marketable food that people wanted instead of a poor people's food that people ate because they had to. But that takes our dairy way back in the area. And then what we look at is how can we best replicate the dairy products and the animals that they had at this time with the animals and the dairy products we have now. The cows were not the same, the pigs were not the same, the sheep are not the same. We still have the genetic material somewhere in there, but what we are really good at is breeding animals and breeding them to get the characteristics that we want now, and just building on that and building on that. And then trying to go back and find the oldest breeds that you can, and then basically guessing from the direction that breeding has taken what those older breeds are going to look like, and what the products that are going to come from those are is kind of a challenge. So for like the pork, recently we have been breeding pork to be lean. Pork used to be much fattier. When you get to 15th, 16th century and you get some still lifes where you can look at some ham, that ham is almost 50% fat. Part of that is the time that you're going to slaughter your pig. You would slaughter it right in the fall, right when the pig has come back in. You can actually let pigs go, and they will come back if you feed them when it gets like shitty out and they can no longer live in their woods. So you can kind of graze pigs to a certain extent. And then when they come back, they are going to be fat for winter. And that's when you slaughter them, and then that fat is for your winter. So when you're looking at early Scandinavian food and trying to recreate it, I try to get fattier cuts, or cut the pork in a way so that there's more fat to it. Depending on who you're feeding this to, you also have to understand that you might have to vary this, because Americans particularly will not eat a big chunk of pork fat unless it's crispy. And so you have to make some changes there. With the dairy, the cows that we have now produce much more milk, and probably a higher cream content of milk than what is going to have been available. They also probably were skimming off of the cream, and then, well, gravity separating. And there's actually a great study out of, okay, I gotta look it up. It's one of the Ivy League colleges. It was weird because it should not have had a study on gravity separation of milk, but they are doing it for small hobby dairies, so that the small hobby dairies could then sell their milk in the US market, because you have to sell it by percentage of fat. And if at about a 60-degree Fahrenheit after a day's sit, if you skim off that milk, then you end up with 1% milk fat in your milk. There's a whole bunch on fat globule size, but that's That's a different class entirely. So when you're doing Viking age food, you want to skim off that fat, use that to make butter, or you can make cheese with the whole milk, or you can make cheese with the dairy. But it really looks like butter was a high value food. There's lots of finds of soured butter, stored butter. Iceland's got some hoards of butter that are just, buried in the ground, because that's how wealth works. You can't let other people have it, or you're not wealthy, but you're not going to use it. So you got to put it somewhere, which is just weird, but we're humans and we do that. And then you take that leftover milk and you can ferment that into skyr. Skyr, as far as I've been able to find, is just kind of a catch-all for fermented milk products. So there's some references to people drinking skyr. There's some references to people eating skyr. I've made a lot of skyr. If you just let it ferment for a day, you can stir it up and drink it. It's sour, it's fine. I don't know, it's not my favorite thing. I like to let it ferment for about 2 days so that it gets a good curd, and then strain it so you get something more like a Greek yogurt. Or you can add a little bit of rennet and have that bacterial ferment, press it for 4 or 5 days, and then you get like a firm, fresh cheese product, which is probably all things that were done in various areas during this time. It's just changes on a theme, so the odds are quite good. We switch over and look at fisheries. Animal husbandry and fisheries were probably the 2 largest caloric industries for the Viking Age. Most of mainland Europe was a grain-based diet, and it looks more like Scandinavia was a dairy and fish-based diet, just because these are easier to do. People are fundamentally lazy. So if your job is to go out and collect food, you're going to collect food in a way that is simplest to get the amount of food that you need to collect. Fish is plentiful in the North Sea and in the Baltic. They've got, this book here is awesome. It is not really a book, it's just a whole bunch of academic articles written on cod and herring throughout goes back some to like Neolithic time up into the end of the Middle Ages, and looks at the migratory patterns and what the estimated fish stocks were all through the Baltic and the North Sea, and it's fantastic. Basically what you have is you have a lot of herring runs. Herring was a really easy fish to catch. There is lots of evidence everywhere around the Scandinavian area that they were eating herring. They were pickling it, they were drying it, they were eating it fresh. It's a fatty fish. If you want to go out and get yourself 10,000 calories, there is no easier way than going out and catching some herring. There's a lot of bang for your buck in a herring. They also went out and got cod, flatfish, haddock, lots of ocean fish. These, if you were in the northern areas along Norway where you could dry them, you can just hang them outside, dry them, and you have a virtually indestructible food thing. Stockfish, or you pound it out, it turns into hard fisker. It really lasts forever. The oldest one, I don't know how old the oldest one. They will last at least 150 years. I don't know if it's edible after 150 years, but it seems to be about the same as when you get it, because stockfish doesn't go worse. It starts out somewhere between the consistency of a board and a piece of steel. It's harder than a board, but it's softer than steel. You can soak it and it will bump back up, but usually you have to beat it with a hammer to separate the fibers so that you can actually get some liquid in there. But it's amazing. It's really, really good. And apparently you shouldn't bring it to hotels very often because people complain. It smells like fish. There's also freshwater fisheries. Every one of the lakes were also fished. There are meeting spaces where there's evidence that before the meetings, people would show up 3 months ahead and just fish the lakes. You would not fish the lake before the gathering. You would just fish it just before the gathering so that you wouldn't deplete the stock. And then this fish was then fermented in the ground. You would make a bladder with leather and then put your fish in it, and then that would preserve it. And so you would have a whole bunch of fermented fish for when everybody showed up. So you didn't have to actually bring your food. Your food was already there. You would probably still bring a lot of food because the only food that was there was fermented fish, and people like variety. Do we have any questions right now? I just want to get to that before we move on to actual agriculture.
Do we have records of the name of the breeds that were found in Scandinavia during that time period? Is there any reference in the literature or in writing to the specific breeds of either sheep or goat or cattle? Or is there any kind of distinctive marks that they alluded to?
Okay, so the question is, are there any distinctive breeds of cattle at the time? And the quick answer is there's no writing at all that says anything about anything specific about any sheep or cattle. We know that they had them. The main writings that we have are the Icelandic sagas, and the Icelandic sagas are actually written 200 years after what they're being written about. And they're written about things that were happening like 800. So there's no accurate descriptions. There are carvings, there's wood carvings, and there's carvings on stone, but they're very stylized. And so, I mean, we know that they had sheep and we know that they have goats, but we don't really know much of anything about what breeds they would have. The closest we can do is we can look back at the oldest breeds that we know of. There's the little shore sheep that live in the tidal zones, and we know that that is probably Viking Age and earlier was where they originated. They're weird little guys, and they eat seaweed, and they have an ability to digest salt that's just ridiculous. If you move them inland, they will die because they don't get enough salt because they eat seaweed. They're the sheep that you pull the wool off of. Cattle, you're probably looking at something that's similar to the Highland cattle in Scotland. I don't think they had like oryx or anything like that. And I might be wrong, that would just take more evidence to find it. Goats, I don't know much about the goats. And horses, the horses are smaller than most of the horses we had now. They're kind of like, they weren't ponies, but they weren't horses. They're like that in between, like a really tall pony or a short horse. And we have most of that genetic material because those horse breeds kind of stayed. That was a popular thing, and it works for the climate. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
In a way of not answering it. Yeah. Okay, then we're going to move on to agriculture. So they did animal husbandry and fishing, but there was also farming. The majority of people were employed gathering food. So you were fishing, you were tending flocks, you were tending to the dairy, or you were planting grain. Most settlements, it looks like, had an area for like a garden, and the garden most likely was for growing vegetables, things like brassicas, like the cabbages. We have bred the shit out of cabbages. That the brassica line probably started at one plant that kind of looked like a rob, probably kind of like a kale, but with fatter leaves. And then we bred that into head cabbage. We bred it into broccoli. We bred it into cauliflower. We bred it into, cabbages. We bred it into kale, Brussels sprouts. All of this is like one plant that we have bred the hell out of. Viking age, it would have been that original plant, which would have been a leafy green that had some of the sturdiness of kale, but more a little bit of the flavor of cabbage. When I'm putting together a cabbage dish for Viking age food, I usually cheat and just go out and gather all of that genetic material back and then cook it all up into a dish that has kale and cabbage and usually a little bit of mustard green, because mustard is delicious as well. And then just put it all back together. But that was probably grown in your garden. It pickles well. It's good fresh. It's hardy. It will make it through the first snow. You also were growing some carrot. The carrot was not nearly as robust as the carrots we have now. Probably woodier, not as sweet. You're also looking at turnips, some beets. The beets would not have been as plump as they are now. They would have been just coming off of being seed beets. So almost more for greens probably than bulbs. As you move into the Viking age, they're breeding those more and you get a larger bulb. But when you're looking at the Vendel period, you would be more looking at greens on your beet than you would be looking at as the beetroot. There's also orchards. We're not sure if they're really like orchards or if it's more like when you're building out from your farm, you're cutting down the trees and turning that into a field. And in that field, you're growing your barley or your rye. And then if you come to a filbert tree, or you come to an apple tree, or you come to a cherry tree, you don't cut that down because that's useful. There's not any evidence that they were growing orchards in a way that we would recognize an orchard. It looks more like they were allowing an orchard to grow. That makes some sense. And so you would have your farm where you lived. You would have your animals that would be right around that. You would have your garden, which is right next to your house. You would have fields out next. It would be barley. The farther north you get, the more barley you get. And then the farther south you get, the more rye you get. And that mostly has to do with just growing conditions. Rye takes longer to get a functional crop than barley. Barley is pretty short, but you get more rye. There's a study that shows the change in pollen counts from various cereal grains throughout Scandinavia over time. And the weird part is, so hulled barley that has a hull stays about solid. And then hullless barley, as you get your rye comes in, the hullless barley starts to go away. So what it kind of looks like is the rye was replacing the hullless barley. So you're probably eating your rye and your hullless barley, and your hulled barley, which is harder to process into a food, is most likely being made into beer, because beer is super important. There's also a little bit of wheat. When you get farther south, there's a little bit more wheat. There was some spelt, but then spelt seems to die off. And I don't know if that's a temperature change or if it's just people stopped growing it and then you just didn't have seed stock and didn't grow it anymore. But there's around 200, there was quite a bit of spelt. And then when you get into like 450, there's just none. Oats were always grown a little bit, not a lot of oats. Oats are another grain that has a hull on them, so they're a little bit harder to deal with. But that was your grain area. And then you would have your orchards that were probably just kind of growing wild that you let and then tended to. The other thing that you would do is you would gather food that was just growing purely wild. Main things you are going to gather is probably honey. There's not any evidence. There's growing discussion about whether or not early Scandinavians actually tended bees. There's not any evidence of hives. There's a compelling argument that honey was valuable enough that they would have paid attention to bees and seen how bees acted and how they reacted, and then would encourage the bees to set up their hives in places that were more convenient to gathering the honey than you marching out into the woods and trying to find a wild beehive, stealing the honey, and then going back home. That's still very much under discussion. Wild greens would be gathered in the spring and throughout the summer. You're looking at like goosefoot and dandelions, cat's ear, sea beans if you're along the coast. They'd also gather quite a bit of seaweed. There's fairly good evidence that they were eating dulse, which is it's a red Atlantic seaweed. You can order it dried too. It makes it easier to get a hold of. Berries were all gathered. There's no evidence that they were growing berries in berry farms. It looks like you just went to where the berries grew and then you harvested the berries. That's still what people do a lot today, so it probably works out with what they were doing then. And then nuts would also be gathered just out in the forest that is beyond where you have the trees that you have pulled to just be the trees that you want. A lot of hazelnuts, some walnuts when you get further south or when you get into Denmark. But hazelnuts is their primary nut. Do we have any other questions right at this point?
Okay, question. Do you have the name of that paper that talks about pollen samples?
Give me a sec. Just a minute, I'm going to share it.
Thank you.
Screen. Okay, here we go. Okay, it's this one. And let me just grab the URL and throw it in chat. Where'd my chat go?
Cereal husbandry, because cereal needs a husband.
It does. Well, it needs consecutive husbands. Okay, I have lost my ability to find, oh, there's chat. There. All right. Are there any other questions?
They're trying to make me ask hard questions. To clarify Thorbjorn's earlier question, was there some kind of trade to transport grain to higher latitudes where they had fish, but not as much agriculture? And was Fjarlagros just an Icelandic thing, or did it grow elsewhere?
I do not know that word. I don't know Fuagberg. Yeah.
I don't
Most
either.
of the stuff that's in Iceland, Iceland is very remote, and their culture and their food culture is very unique to them because they have a situation that is unlike anyone else. It is similar and it is based on Scandinavian influence, but once you got to Iceland, they had some really different sets of circumstances on what they needed to do. Their ability to grow grain was way less than mainland Scandinavia. They cut down all their trees, and then they had no wood. There are just some things that life was different in Iceland than it is anywhere else. As far as trade goes, there was a lot of trade. There was trade in stockfish. There was trade in grain. There was trade in soapstone and in iron. There was a lot of trade going around, not only within Scandinavia, but also throughout the Baltic Sea and over into the Baltic states. There was trade going over into like Estonia and that area as well. There's a common misperception that the Scandinavians just lived in Scandinavia, and then suddenly they went to Linden's farm and their world changed. It didn't. They had been trading and moving around for hundreds of years. There's a lot of, migration period happened because Rome fell, and then there was a vacuum and people were moving around. And that's where you got a large chunk of population coming up into Scandinavia, is people have been moving around and migrating and trading for thousands of years. And so yes, they would trade grain for fish and other goods and jewelry and anything else that they would want to. The difference between the Vendel age and the Viking age really has to do with when they put sails on their longboats. Viking age, they put sails on their longboats, and they suddenly had some technology that was magical in the way that they could get places very, very, very quickly. The earlier ships were not as fast and not as versatile, and so they stayed closer to home.
Okay, Lady Leon asks, does anyone have a source for asbestos-free soapstone, cutting boards, bowls, serving pieces?
Once you have heated it up, the asbestos is no longer going to be coming out. So you can get your bowls and whatever soapstone implements that you need and heat them up, and then don't carve them, don't grind them. That's really where the asbestos is in the stone. It's not going to leave, and asbestos kills you by getting into your lungs. So do not do anything with your soapstone that is going to make any of it become airborne if you are not wearing a full respirator. That's my soapstone advice. Or you can order fully already made pots from Brazil and from Korea. You can also get them from Scandinavia, but I don't know anybody that is exporting them. But if you go there and get them, then you can bring them back yourself. It's expensive. It's also expensive to ship them from Korea and Brazil, but less so than flying there yourself. Okay, Now we're going to go on to looking at something that's not what they had, but what is conspicuously absent in early Scandinavian cuisine. And the two things that are conspicuously absent, and we're not talking about the greater Viking area that includes all of, the British Isles and France and half the Balkan states and parts of Russia and that, but just actually in Scandinavia itself. There's two things that are conspicuously absent. Shellfish is one of them. And the other one is any large salt works. Shellfish is really easy to find out if people have been eating shellfish, because if you are eating a whole bunch of mussels, or you're eating a whole bunch of clams, or eating a whole bunch of crabs or lobsters, and they had them, there were plenty of them. The ocean was full of them. If you eat them, then you get mounds of shells. And everywhere that people eat shellfish, there are mounds of shells. During this period, there are not mounds of shells. So we are very, very sure that, well, there's two things that could happen. A, they didn't eat any shellfish, or B, there was some social reason that anytime you ate shellfish, you put all the shells back in the boat, sailed them out in the ocean, and threw them in the ocean. It's not impossible. It's just weird, so it's less probable. So it's most probable that in Scandinavia there was some taboo that the shellfish, you just didn't eat that. That happens in every culture. Like here, we have a ton of grasshoppers, super nutritious, good for you, taste great when you cook them. We just don't eat that. Once they got out into, say, Ireland, ate the shit out of mussels. They ate lots of them. They ate all sorts of shellfish on the British Isles. But even weirder is then during that same period, when they were obviously eating all this shellfish in Britain, they were still not eating that shellfish in Scandinavia, because you just didn't do that. It's weird, but it's a food thing. It happens in other cultures too, that if you travel, it's okay to eat this, but then you come home, it's gross. Look at sushi before 30 years ago. Go to Japan, sushi's great. Go to rural America, it's the most disgusting thing you can find. People shouldn't eat raw fish. Now people do, but it's a changing taste, and the shellfish is weird in that. The salt works is a little bit more odd, but I kind of think that what people were doing, most of the population was living within about 1 mile of saltwater. There's very little of the Scandinavian population that was not either right on the ocean or up a river where you could easily ship saltwater. It is hard in Scandinavia to evaporate seawater. You don't have the heat in order to make pools like you do down in the Mediterranean or even in France. You don't have the huge lead industry that you had on the British Isles that would make it so you can make big lead pans and then use that as evaporation. Salt works. There's not any evidence that they were mining salt until later. There are salt mines in Scandinavia, but they started after the Viking Age. So they were probably just using seawater for their salt. The other option is they weren't eating salt. That's super unlikely. They were people, and they had easy access to lots of 3.5% salinity solution, which is the entirety of the North Sea and the Baltic. I did the math on it. If you use hardwood like oak, and you're only getting about a 30% conversion, which is about correct for if you're just boiling your water, you can do a 50% reduction and then use that 7% brine to preserve any of the meat that you have. That's a perfectly reasonable brine to preserve meats. And it's going to take about 1 kilogram of wood to preserve 1 kilogram of meat. Now, that's not too much work. So I'm pretty sure that they were just making brine, and then using that brine to salt whatever they are wanting. And then if you're going to salt your food, you put some food that is salty in your food, or you put some seawater into your food. If you're just trying to do a lactose fermentation, a 3.5% brine, it's fine. You would need to boil that seawater anyway to kill all of the interesting things that live in seawater that aren't going to make your cabbages the best pickles known to mankind. So you're probably going to have about a 4% brine just by bringing it up to a boil. And then you use that water to start your lacto fermentation, and you can make anything without much effort. There's just the vast majority of early Scandinavian cuisine involved putting your food into water. And so it just makes very little sense as far as time consumingness to take your salty water, take the salt out of your salty water, and then put your salt back into your water to make your water salty so you can make food. And it hits on that fundamental of people are lazy and they're going to do the thing that is easiest to do. So they were probably using barrels of salt water and brine, and that was their salt. And all of their preserved food that was preserved in salt would also be your salt that you would then put into your food. Do you have any questions on that, on the things that are missing? I guess we can go.
I'm real curious about the shellfish issue. So there's really nothing in any existing writings or cultural knowledge that would suggest that they had a bad problem with red tides or something like that would lead to a taboo.
That's kind of what I think happened. So there's
Right.
This is way before. Okay, so if you go to Scarabray on Orkney, that island had been inhabited for what, 8,000 years, and for 1,000 years it was just a place where people went in the summer and ate a bunch of shellfish. There's a place where they stopped because they were throwing all of their shells into the trash, and there is 200-300 years in there where they stopped eating shellfish. And then they started eating it again. So I don't know if just nobody was living there during that period of time, but it really kind of looks like there may have been a red tide. People died, and they're just like, you know what? I ain't risking it. But then a couple 100 years later, they're like, you know what's delicious? Mussels. Sven's been eating them, and he's fine. So we just don't know because they didn't write anything down. All we know is what they didn't throw away. And there's still that very slim chance that there may have been something that you didn't throw your shells on the ground. You had to throw your shells in the ocean, which is a really weird thing. It's not an impossible thing. I would give that, like a 4% chance, but always never think that you know. Once you've decided that you know something and you have a belief, it's really, really hard to break that. And so just try not to have any beliefs. Don't have anything that is that hill you're willing to die on. Just realize it's a hill, and if somebody digs that hill away, you're okay with just going and finding another hill.
Yeah, that made me think of the ship made out of fingernail trimmings at Ragnarok.
Yeah.
Maybe they had a similar, tradition. There was going to be a ship made of oyster shells that.
I mean, there could be, because that did make them trim everybody's nails. I mean, which is a super weird thing to do. That is not normal. So yeah, who knows? It's one of the mysterious things that's really kind of fun. But yeah, they totally ate all the shellfish when they went other places. So we're going to move on and look at actual cooking techniques and the way in which people cooked. Your number one method of cooking in early Scandinavia was you put the food into a pot and then you put in some liquid and you cooked it that way. This could be putting a lid on it and letting it steam. It could be giving it a hard boil. It was probably a lot of simmering. Simmering is just an easier way to cook things. When you're dealing with the summertime, you had a lot of fuel. Fuel was not hard to get unless you're in Iceland and you already burned down all your trees. But if you're in Sweden or in Denmark, there are forests. You go out and you pick up a lot of branches, and most of the fuel that you're going to be using for cooking is not, big logs. It's not chunks of firewood. You're going to be going out and gathering branches that are, this big or smaller in big bundles and stacking them. And that's your fuel. It's easy to get, it's plentiful. In the wintertime, you're always going to have a fire going because it's cold. And so just having a pot on the fire is a really easy, economical way in which to cook your food. It's also super efficient. During the early Scandinavian time, there was very few ovens. Once you get into the Viking Age and you get some larger settlements and you get some more outside influence, you get some ovens in some of the larger towns. So people were not baking things in ovens. That's not a way that they cook things. The querns that they used were not big mills. They used hand querns. Just a minute. I'm gonna pop up some pictures here, and my pictures did not stay in the order that I wanted them, but they'll work.
Tracy asks, did they bake under a cloche? The bell-shaped cover.
I have not seen any, so I don't think that they did. They didn't make a lot of things out of clay. The clay in the area is kind of crappy, and they just didn't have a big pottery culture. They made a lot of things with soapstone. They were very good smiths. You'd make pots out of copper and copper alloys and iron. Okay, so this is a quern, and this is what you would use to grind all your grain. And this is a big one. So this would be the maximum size of a quern that you're likely to get. This one's actually from Normandy in France. So grain goes into that middle part. You turn it by hand, and then the ground flour comes out the bottom. It doesn't grind it all the way on the first shot. You have to run it through a couple of times. This is what the stones look like. So it has grooves, and then the flour will move out. Grinding grain at the time it's labor intensive. Jeroen and the Viking traders have a wonderful hand quern that they made. It's a little bit lighter than the ones that would normally be in use because they also carry it to events. And it's great for children, wonderful for child labor. But grinding grain was difficult because you had to do it by hand on one of these querns, or you did it on a flat quern, which is basically just a rock, and then you're rolling another rock over the top of it, which is an older style of quern, and even less efficient. They did not have the giant grain mills. And so what this kind of, well, strongly implies is that they did not value flour as highly as the rest of Europe did. They did have grain, they did grind it, but they did not have that bread culture that that the rest of Europe was enjoying. This makes me think that more of that was than just grain put into that pot and boiled into a porridge. It's super easy. You lose none of your nutritional value. It matches up with the implements and the tools that they had. Most of your eating implements were either a wooden trencher or bowl and then a spoon. And eating porridge with a spoon is really easy. Here's some porridge. Camera, that's my lunch. It's a gratin. It's just it's barley and vegetables and chicken, and it's delicious. It has a nutritional profile that is, if you add skyr onto it, comes out at about 40% protein, 30% carbohydrates, 30% fat. It's a fantastic diet. Scandinavians were actually pretty healthy, all things considered. And that's where we're going to get to. We're not there yet. Sorry, all my pictures have gone weird. So. This is an iron pot. This is the Augsburg pot. This is a pot chain that was also found buried there. So this is what your pot looked like. This is your quern that you would use to grind all your grain. A handle would go in here, grain would go in, and this is my Augsburg replica pot. I was trying to find out. So with Augsburg, it came with this really fancy iron tripod with chicken feet, and it's awesome, but it's also grave goods. So probably not what you're doing every day. This is probably more what it's going to look like if you are traveling somewhere and then cooking dinner. You just get some saplings, you tie them together at the top, you hang your pot from a rope. This took exactly 5.5 minutes to build. And that pot is enough food to feed 50 people. It currently has enough food to feed like 12 people, and it looks like somebody like put some stuff in the bottom of it. But that's how you would eat traveling. I don't have it. Sorry, I thought I had a picture of what the spits look like. So the Viking Age cooking spits, there's not a lot of them. They were not something that if you were not wealthy, you would just not have them. They were not like most of the European spits, which you would put across, put something on, and then turn it in front of a fire in order to cook it over a long period of time, like making a roast beef or like the spits that you've seen with a spit boy that turns them. The spits look more like an iron spear that just had a stabby point and then a couple of prongs, something to hold whatever you put on there, which makes it look like you did not cook things in a long way on that spit, because you would have to hold that spit the entire time that you're cooking, or you would have to lean it on something, and it's awkward. It's not good for long-term holding. What I personally think the spit was used more for is I think you cooked your food in the pot, then you took your food out of the pot, put it onto the spit, and then finished up the outside over the fire. So you still get that great umami, you get that crispy skin on your birds, you get that that nice caramelization on your meat. But all of the fat that came off is still in that water. So you're holding it, you're saving it there. And a calorie saved is a calorie that you didn't have to go out and gather again. So that was probably more how they did it. We've actually done ducks this way. It's fantastic. You take your duck, you put it in the pot, and you just kind of simmer it for about an hour till it's cooked through. Most of that fat has rendered off of it. And then you high heat roast it for just like 10 minutes, and it crisps up that skin, gets you that molten crispy fat underneath it. And then you let the pot cool, and you have all of that duck fat right there. You can pull it off and use it for other things. So it seems like something that spit would work well for. And when you actually use that technique, it also gives you a better product that you're eating at the end of it. And it's giving you all of that delicious duck fat that you can use for other things that's safe sitting on top of that pot. So it's highly likely that's a cooking method that was used. Do we have any questions on that? And the next thing I'm going to go into is just pot chains. Let me see if I can get comments back.
Why are we looking at the fish?
Because that was the last picture I had. Here, I can stop sharing. Bye, fish. Okay, fish is gone. Sorry, I thought I had a picture of the spit at the end, but instead I had a picture of fish. So you had to look at fish. So we're going to go to, no, I'm going to go back to sharing. And we're going to look at this pot chain. Pot chains is something that I've been working with more recently and trying to figure out what is it about a pot chain that makes it more useful than just using a rope. So this chain here is the one from burial. So it is very ornate. This would take a lot of work to do. It would be incredibly expensive. And things that take a lot of work and are very expensive, there's usually a reason for them. There has to be a reason for them. And there are pot chains that are not ornate like this, that are just a chain that has some hooks so that you can shift the height of your pot up and down. And I'm trying to figure out why doing this with a chain, which is expensive and hard to make, is better than doing this with any other material, which is easy to make and cheaper. You're not really worrying about your chain catching on fire. Your fire is never going to be that high. This is above your pot. This pot, you would be able to pick up the handle and it's going to be fine. It doesn't get that hot when you're above a pot that has liquid in it. I mean, that steam that's coming off of that is 200 and some odd degrees, and then it's going up and you've got some breeze and it's going to be hot. But if you've got Teflon hands, you could probably just pick that pot right up. So figuring out why they would use a pot chain is kind of a challenge. I think has to do with the little frying pans and the little swirly thing. I'm sure everyone's seen the swirly thing that is part of every Viking reenactment kit, but is really actually only found in one place. Nobody knows exactly what it's for, but it kind of looks like a tiny grill. It might be used for searing things. It might be used for heating up and making drinks hot. It might have been a joke or to see if somebody could make one. I don't know. It's a weird thing. But my theory on pot chains, and I'm going to work on it some more, is that they were trying to take the most socially valuable food that they have and then make it in the best way possible. So with social value, the beef is probably your highest social value food. Butter is also a high social value. Yeah, no, your rope won't burn. Your rope will literally not burn. You can hang it above that fire for a year and your rope won't burn. It's just, you don't build your fire that big. But it does give you exact links on how high you can make things. And you can give someone instruction on that, and that might help. But I think that you were taking some of your large chunks of fresh meat and more trying to like sous vide cook it in a brine, so that you would have something that would be medium rare and then sear it. So that you would have the best possible food made with the most expensive ingredient in the most flamboyant way. So if you're hanging something from this pot chain and you're having a large feast and you're trying to get this social capital by making everybody think that you're awesome because you're feeding them awesome food, and you live in this amazing house, and you're keeping them and getting them drunk for 3 days, this would be like your centerpiece. And if you could put this in front of them, and then you have the kind of the star of your meal sitting above your fire, and it's there for kind of as long as you want, because that pot is 125 degrees with perfectly medium rare beef in it. And then as you serve it to the people, you're grabbing it with your pot with the kettle hook, slicing off a chunk, and then searing it either with a spit, or with that swirly thing, or on your iron frying pan. Because all three of those things are made out of iron. They're expensive. They're also fancy. Many of them are decorated, and that's going to be a presentation. And that's kind of where I think the pot chains come in. And I am probably wrong in some respect, but so far that's the best answer I have. I really doubt that the pot chain was used in the standard area of your cooking area of your house, where not many people are seeing it, because it's too beautiful, it's too expensive, and it's a centerpiece. So sorry, that's my diatribe on pot chains. Has anyone used pot chains or played with them at all?
Yes,
Yeah.
I have a tripod and I've used it with the chain and lowering and adjusting heat and everything using a chain.
Have you found it is any easier than any other method, or is it just convenient? Or
I thought it was convenient, so I can lower instead of stoking the fire. Sometimes you just need that subtlety and you can just lower it or raise it up using the chain.
okay, yeah, I've done some, and I haven't done anything with a really, really long one and with a really big pot, and that's my next thing I need to play with. But I need space and 10 feet of roof area. So it should work, but I want to play with it, and I think I can get that. I want to be able to get to a point where I can keep my pot sitting at 125 degrees for at least an hour. And if I can do that, then I'm pretty happy that the results are going to be fantastic, because that's going to give me that perfectly cooked piece of meat all the way through that I can then sear off as I'm sending it around to the people that are worthy enough to eat it. Okay, and then the next thing that has a whole bunch of discussion in pretty much any Viking group is alliums. So there's not a different word or rune or symbol for garlic and leeks and onions and shallots. There's one that just kind of means alliums. We're pretty sure that people ate them. There's jewelry that has the runes on it. There is 2 instances of actual alliums that are found. This one that we're looking at right now, this was found in Denmark in the 700s. It was in a little bronze box in a burial, in with some yellow yarn. It kind of looks like a shallot. As far as I know, they have not done DNA analysis on it. I would really like them to do that. The thing with DNA analysis is it's slightly destructive, and they would actually have to take some of this 1,300-year-old onion and find out what it is. This is about 2 centimeters across, so it's not really big, but it's also completely dried. So this was probably a shallot-sized allium of some sort. And then they thought it was important enough that it went into a box along with some yarn, which I don't know how this goes together. I don't know what the dye used in that yarn was. I don't know if that was maybe an onion skin type of dye. Not my area of study. And also nothing I've been able to find. But then they buried it with this woman. So she's the only one that I know of that has ever been buried with an onion. So it's not something that you're going to do all of the time. It's not common, but it happened. So there's kind of 2 ways to look at this. Either this particular person really, really liked onion, or this person really, really hated onions, and the person that buried her also really hated her. We don't know which of those 2 is. It's probably something that they really liked onions because they had some fancy stuff. But people that have fancy stuff also have people who work for them who do not much care for them. This is also a kind of universal truth. So it's weird. And so we don't know why it was buried. But what we do know is that they had it. And so in 700, there was some kind of bulb onion, probably a shalloty thing, being grown, or like a small onion being grown in Denmark. The other onion we have, sorry, more fish. All of the onions are actually fish. Okay, this is the other onion. This was found in Sandborg. It's from the 400s. When this was originally found, Sandborg is a weird place. They pissed people off somehow, not quite sure, but people went in there, killed everybody in the village. It was a walled fort. There does not appear to have been a war to get them in there. They just went in there, killed everybody in their homes, and then they left and never came back. And nobody ever went back. The sheep that were in the pen starved to death and died. He didn't take those. The gold was still buried next to the door where apparently you bury your gold, so no one can find it, although everybody buries it in the same place. So not sure how that works. But the cool thing, if you like food, is that there was herring on the table, and there was this next to the hearth underneath a beam that the house had caught fire, and the beam had fallen down and then trapped this underneath it, and then it had carbonized. And when it was first found, they thought it was a nut, and then they took it in and x-rayed it, and this is actually a bulb onion. So this is a bulb onion that theoretically was only in like Spain at this point, that was most definitely on an island off the coast of Sweden in the 400s. So leeks are one of those fun things that everyone knows Vikings ate leeks, but there is exactly zero evidence of leeks in Scandinavia. We know that when people started writing things down, that they ate leeks a lot, and that there were plenty of leeks, and there was descriptions of leeks, and it wasn't like leeks were a new thing. It was just that leeks were always around. We just don't have any. There's no desiccated leek in a tomb. And the problem with leeks is if you just throw them out, they go away. If you put a leek in the trash, it's just gone. Size of this one. This one, I believe this is about the size of a chestnut. It's like 2.5 centimeters. I might be incorrect. I would have to look that up. I'm sorry, the picture that I grabbed does not have the little centimeter meter on it. But it's not hazelnut size. It's more chestnut size. It's a weird find, and I don't know why they thought it was a nut before, because there's not. I mean, maybe a walnut, but there's no nuts that match it. It's just that it comes back to that don't have a belief, because they have a belief that there were no bulb onions in Sweden at this time, and that there would not be any bulb onions in Sweden until at least the 900s. So the 700s swept that back, but then there's a lot of people that had the belief then that onion that was then in the burial was something special that had been imported. And that's a good argument if there's one, but now there's two. And if you have two, the argument that they are a unique item goes out the window, and they are probably much, much more common than they are uncommon. So my theory on alliums is that bulb onions they had. They were probably small. They may have been shallots. And I also think that they probably had leeks, and we just don't have the evidence of them. I'm not saying people that use leeks are wrong. I use leeks a lot. I'm also not sure how many onions they made. There's just the problem with onions is if you do not consciously preserve them in some way, there's just no evidence that they existed at all after 1,000 years. This one was an accident, got carbonized. The other one got mummified. If it hadn't been in this little brass box and hadn't also been in there with the yarn that was wicking away any moisture that was there, that onion wouldn't have survived either. It's a really kind of interesting thing. Garlic they probably didn't have. Garlic is, so the Romans definitely brought garlic as far as the British Isles. They didn't get much farther than that. There's ramsons, which are like wild garlic that grow in Scandinavia. They come up in the spring and they have a wonderful little flavor. They don't dry and preserve the same way as southern garlic does. They're considered wild garlic, but it's just not the same thing. They do give your springtime food an amazing flavor. Oh, good. Yeah. Oh no, we do have time. Okay. Sorry, I was panicking there for just a minute because we had that thing where everything was off by half an hour, and I thought that we had like 9 minutes left, and that wouldn't be good. Does anyone have any questions about alliums and onions and how looking at that is, well, in the Viking food world, a great hot debate?
No, you were pretty clear about everything.
And also remember, I'm probably wrong. And there are plenty of people out there that will tell me that I'm wrong and that these two onions are anomalies. And that this onion was actually brought back by soldiers from their Roman working time as an onion, and then placed next to the cooking hearth where it would then get crushed by a burning thing. And that makes no sense to me, because I cook. And if you have something that is valuable and like a memento, you don't stick it next to the cooking fire, you put it somewhere where people can see it. Things that you put next to the cooking fire are shit you're gonna put into a pot and cook. So I am like 99% sure that this particular onion was going to no longer be a solid onion by the end of the day and was going to go into a pot somewhere. I don't know how they're going to cook it, but I'm pretty sure that it was going into a pot, and that makes it probably something that came as seed or as seed onions and then was planted and grown. It wasn't a special day, and it was sitting next to the cook fire.
I do a little natural dyeing, and I can tell you that onions, particularly yellow onion skins, make an incredible yellow dye that is, it's not lemon, it's a little more on the golden side, and it could be the dye that dyed that wool, which is why they were put together. The other thing is that we know that the Vikings used yellow dye made of weld, which is, it lasts longer than other yellows. But there is also something that is referred to in the literature as yellow X, because they found yellow goods that do not test out to be weld, and they don't know what it is yet.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, I would really, really like to know more about that find and what that wool was, and what the yarn was, what the yarn was dyed with, and we can do a DNA analysis on the damn onion. I would be okay with losing just a little tiny bit, but it's not my onion, so I don't get to make that choice. And I'm selfish. I want to know what that onion is. No, that's cool though. I knew you could make dye out of, and that's why I need more people that know a variety of things. The best way to do, especially early Scandinavian research, is there needs to be an incredibly broad base, and you need to talk to as many people from as many different focuses as you can, because everything is connected. The entire society is connected. What you're eating has to do with what you're wearing, and what you're wearing has to do with how you're gathering the food that you're eating, and what people are trading has to do with what they value in society, and how you bring all of that together all has an impact on your cuisine and what flavors you're going to want to eat. And I need to learn more about dyeing, and I need to learn more about weaving. I know like a little bit. I am well up here on Idiot Mountain on the Dunning-Kruger, and I'm well aware of that. And so I just remember that I'm actually sitting down here and I don't know shit. And that's an important thing to keep reminding yourself, is that the things that you know, no matter how much you do know, are dwarfed by the things that we don't know. And so just don't get beliefs. Keep trying things, seeing how they work, and try as hard as you can to find out that you're wrong. Because you can know with a very, very good degree of assurity that you're wrong, but you can never know with that same degree of assurity that you're right. And so finding out that something that you thought or that you're trying out is wrong is just, it's the best. It's finding out something doesn't work, because you can skip through that, and then you don't worry about that again, unless you found out that you were wrong about being wrong. That's farther down the rabbit hole. The other study that came out recently and has been in like SCA cooks and in the Viking groups is it's a latrine study, the fragments of meals in Eastern Denmark from the Viking Age to the Renaissance. It only has a very, very small chunk that's Viking Age, and then the rest of it is Renaissance and medieval. but it's a study looking at latrines, going through the latrines and finding all organic matter and looking at the pollen that is actually in the latrines. We have the technology to do that now. We didn't used to have that. And so this shit makes me excited. And that pun is only sort of intended. The kind of cool thing that it did is it pushed back the date in which we knew that rhubarb and cucumbers were in Scandinavia by about 200 years, but that's still nowhere near Viking age. Vikings did not have rhubarb, they did not have cucumbers. The most notable thing from this study in the Viking samples that they had was that there was a lot of pollen samples found from knotgrass or knotweed. It's a relative of buckwheat, and that was the largest count of pollen was this. It's knotgrass, and I don't know if they grew this on purpose or if it's a weed that grew around the latrines. What we do know is that some people ate it. 500 years earlier, it's in Tolunman. I think it's Tolunman. Bog body found in around 400 in Denmark, and in their stomach there was knotgrass. That's part of what they ate for whatever their last meal was before they ended up in the bog. We don't know why they ended up in the bog, just that they ended up in the bog and somebody put them there on purpose. So at some point people were eating knotgrass. There's not a lot of information after the Viking period when people started writing things down about them continuing to eat knotgrass. But the huge amount of pollen that is found kind of makes me think that they were eating knotgrass during the Viking era. Knotgrass seeds are probably not something that you're going to get unless you pick them wild, but you can substitute them when you're just trying to do Viking recreation with buckwheat. And this makes me super happy because buckwheat doesn't have gluten in it, and a lot of times you have to make something for people that can't have gluten, and this gives you a probable porridge that is gluten resistant. When you're doing a Viking feast, I never tell people that it is gluten free. There is almost always gluten in the kitchen at some point. We just do the best we can to make it so that the gluten is over here and the not gluten is over here, and they don't get together. And buckwheat gives you a wonderful consistency of a porridge that you can do without the gluten, and is probably a correct food that people were eating. It may not have been an upper level food. It was probably a more poor people food. Just because there's no writings about people eating knotgrass seed. Somebody said something about flax. They did grow flax. Definitely grew flax. Definitely ate the seeds. Definitely weave stuff out of it. I don't know if that was the question. I'll get to that in a minute. And then the rest of the study is actually it's later period, and it gets into mostly medieval and gets into the Renaissance. But you can see when spices came in, and also you can kind of see the honey trade and where the honey started coming up from the south, because you start getting pollen from plants that could not have grown in the area that people were pooping, and so that pollen probably came in as honey. And honey was a known important import. Honey and beeswax were things that Scandinavia imported a lot of. They like their mead, and they liked honey as a sweetener, probably as mead, probably more. There's a reason that the gods drank mead, though. It wasn't something you drank every day. Honey was expensive. It was hard to come by. Most people probably never had a true mead. They probably had a ale that was made with some honey, and that was their mead that they got at feast time, because they didn't sit with the important people who were actually drinking mead, because those people knew what they would be drinking and they died. The things that the gods drink are usually not what you drink every day. There's a reason the gods drink them. It's because they're awesome and you can't have them. So that just came out this year. I have not dug through and hashed out the rest of it, but the biggest part of that is just the amount of that knotweed that was there, and that getting an entire another grain that can go into dishes is fantastic. Has anyone else read that, or? Oh well. Then the next part, when looking at early Scandinavian cuisine, is we have all of our, and we're going to get to the sheep and stuff here, looking at the differences between what we have now, what we have the first time people put together botanicals, and what the plants and animals looked like in the Vendel and early Viking Age. So we're looking at the animals in 600, and the best information we have is from around 11 or 1200. And so you have 600 years of selective breeding going on between what we're trying to recreate and the first thing that we have really shitty knowledge of. And it's not good knowledge, it's bad knowledge. Between fires and just lack of writing things down, there's not a lot of written record of Scandinavian food before you get into the late to middle ages. It's a little bit frustrating. So then you have to look at your plants and kind of look at the biology of them and how they moved. Like Swedes. Swedes are turnips that have crossbred with beets, or they're sea beets and turnips. So looking at those, we know that they were grown in Sweden in 1100. We don't know when they got there. They were growing so many of them that people called them Swedes because they're there. They could have been there for 500 years. They could have been there for 50 years, or they could have been there for 100 years. We know that the first one started out in Russia, and then they moved through the Balkans, and at some point made that jump across the water, and then ended up in Sweden. Around 500, they were in the Estonian area, and then in 1100 they were definitely in Sweden. Were they in Sweden in 600? We don't know, but that's one of those things that most people will not use them when they're doing a recreation. I'm not sure that that's fair. There's just as much evidence that a Swede was there as there is evidence that there was a leak there. Turnips, we're pretty sure were there. Turnips have been bred over the years to be larger and have a bigger root. So you can kind of assume that the older they get, the smaller they get. This could be incorrect, and they may have just a point where they're just like a size. As far as I know, we have not found any extant neeps of any kind, no turnips, no parsnips. We have pollen from turnips and parsnips, but actual turnips and parsnips we don't have. We know that there is mustard. We know there was black mustard. We don't know how strong the mustard flavor of the mustard was, because we have now bred mustard to have that bite be stronger. And we have bred different mustard to have bigger leaves. And then we have bred all of the cabbages, which is probably the easiest one to look at. When you're looking at cherries, we have a large number of cherry pits. They are not going to be the exact breeds of cherries that we have now. They probably wouldn't be as plump. They probably wouldn't have as much juice. When you're looking at drying them, though, that doesn't matter as much. We do know that they were sweet, so that was probably an easier way to be a sweetener. There's just not a lot of sweeteners in the early Viking age. You've got honey and you have fruit, and possibly malt syrup. If you malt your grain and then boil it down, you get a sweetener that can also be used for some other things. We don't know for sure if they made malt syrup. Probably. It's not hard to do. It's not a big leap. Hazelnuts are almost exactly the same now as they were then. We have not messed with hazelnuts very much at all, which I'm not sure if there's just not the genetic diversity to make the hazelnuts into something else, or if there's just not or if they're good enough as they are. We bred them to have more nuts, but the hazelnut itself seems to be pretty similar to the hazelnuts that they had. Grain, the barley that we have now is fuller, so you have more barley on the shaft. We also bred it so that it's easier to harvest. Their barley, you would lose more when you're cutting it, so your yield would be lower per acre. So growing barley at the time would have been harder than growing barley now. Same with all of your other grains, your rye and your wheats. Wheat we've messed with a lot. We've messed with wheat to raise its gluten content. We've messed with wheat to make it so that it matures faster. We've messed with wheat so that it has bigger kernels. It's the more valuable the cash crop is, the more we seem to screw with the genetics. Does anyone have any questions there? Or what I have now is just open discussion and questions on anything having to do with Scandinavian food, or doing research on things that are not just written down. That's the biggest part of researching early Scandinavian food, is it's not written down. There's no recipes. There are 0 recipes. There are 0 tax records of what people were trading in. All you have is things that people talked about that were outside the society, things that people have written about from hundreds of years later, and then the evidence of what's been dug up. So it gets fun. Kind of what I think the flavor profile is I think sour was very important. Sour flavor coming in with salty. So salty, sour, sweet, lower on the list. A strong umami component, because they fermented a lot of fish and meats. So you're probably looking at a salty, sour, savory as your main, your trademark of what is a Viking food. And that's the flavor that people are looking for, with the accents coming in of the sweet to dance with the sour. But you just didn't, sweet was special, so it wasn't standard.
Well,
Are
this
there
has
any
been
other-
a very sweet hour or two. I'm going to stop the recording if we're just lapsing into question and answer. I am being called to another duty, so thank you very much for your time, sir. Various people who had to go also wanted me to relay their thanks as well. And we will see you later in the show.
Okay, thanks.